By dawn in 1927, somewhere in the high pine country of Colorado, the mail coach rolled back into the station yard with every strap buckled tight, every wheel tracking straight, every parcel still stacked clean and dry in the leather boot. The driver sat upright in his bench, rein slack across his lap, hat pulled low against the early cold. The horses stood calm in their traces, breath steaming in the thin mountain air. But the German shepherd that had run the switchbacks alongside that coach every evening since late spring, the one trained to spot rockfall, dead timber across the road, and men with bad ideas waiting in the shadows past the guardrails, was gone. And on the iron rail 30 yards up the fourth turn, where the road carved blind into granite and the canyon dropped 300 feet to broken talus below, someone found his brass tag lying flat on the metal, still warm to the touch in air cold enough to frost a man's breath. No blood, no struggle, no dog. The route threaded the backbone country west of the Continental Divide, where timber operators and cattle outfits sent their mail down to the valley towns in canvas sacks, and travelers paid silver coin to ride the plank benches bolted along the coach sides. It was a narrow road, mostly gravel and crushed shale, carved into slopes so steep that in some places you could look straight down from the wheel rut and see nothing but air and pine tops far below. The switchbacks were tight and blind, each one hooking back on itself so sharp that the driver had to lean out and holler before he made the turn, just so anyone coming up the other way would know to pull their rig close to the rock face and wait. In spring, snowmelt ran across the road in silver sheets that froze again after sunset. In autumn, wind off the peaks could lift a tarp clean off a freight stack or knock a standing man sideways if he wasn't braced. It was the kind of country that sorted men fast, those who could hold a line and those who turned back before the first hard frost. The mail company had hired steady men for that route, the kind you could trust to run alone and not lose their nerve when the light failed and the road narrowed to a single track above the void. And they had hired Rex, a dark-saddled shepherd with pale amber eyes and a bark that carried across canyons and startled hawks off their roosts, to walk the line ahead of the evening coach and scout for trouble. He'd been doing that work since he was 2 years old, running the switchbacks every evening just before sunset, checking the turns for rockslide, fresh deadfall, or the kind of men who waited where the road bent blind and a driver couldn't see what lay ahead until it was too late to stop. Rex's handler was a man named Talus, 42, lean and quiet, who'd worked stock routes and freight lines through Colorado and Wyoming since before the war. He lived in a timber frame boarding house 2 streets back from the station yard, kept his boots polished by the door and his coat on a brass peg beside the window, and left coffee money on the kitchen counter every morning before first light. He'd raised Rex from a pup, taught him to trot ahead on the uphill climbs and wait at the top of each switchback until Talus gave a low 2-note whistle to send him forward to the next turn. The dog never chased game. He never barked at passengers or shied from strangers. And when the coach tilted hard on a rutted section or the horses balked at the edge of a steep grade, Rex would stop square in the center of the road, ears forward, and refuse to move until Talus came up on foot to see what the trouble was. People in Colorado still say that dogs saved more runs than any second driver or armed guard ever could have, just by standing still when something wasn't right. On the evening Rex disappeared, the air up on the switchbacks was perfectly still. No wind, no bird call, no rustle of pine needles or scrape of squirrel claw on bark. The last sunlight sat low and heavy across the high ridges to the west, staining the granite outcrops a deep orange red, and the canyon below the road lay so quiet and so dark that you could hear the iron hubs of the coach wheels ticking as they cooled, hear the soft creak of the leather boot settling under the weight of the mail sacks, hear the faint huff of the led horse shifting weight from one hoof to the other. Talus had just cleared the 3rd switchback, a long climbing curve that hooked left around a shoulder of broken shale, and was approaching the 4th turn, the sharpest and blindest of the route, when Rex broke into a run and sprinted forward around the bend. Talus heard the dog's claws scatter gravel, heard the sound fade fast as Rex pulled ahead, and then heard nothing at all. He waited. He gave his usual whistle, low and short, 2 notes rising. The sound came back flat and lifeless off the rock face across the canyon. No answering bark, no patter of paws returning. Just the creak of the coach settling behind him and the thin whisper of air moving through the pines far below the road. Talus walked forward slowly, boots crunching on gravel, and rounded the blind turn into the fourth switchback. The road there bent so sharply back on itself that a man standing at the outer rail could look almost straight down at the section he'd just traveled. The guardrail, 4 horizontal iron bars bolted to timber posts sunk deep in the roadbed, stood intact. The road was empty. No dog, no movement. And lying flat on the top rail of the guardrail, clean and still, was Rex's brass identification tag, stamped with his name and the coach company's address in the valley town below. When Hallis picked it up barehanded, the metal was warm enough that it left a faint tingle of heat in his palm, even though the air around him was cold enough to frost the iron and sting his throat when he breathed deep. The tag had been fastened to Rex's collar with a thick leather strap and a copper rivet punched through both layers. The leather was gone. The rivet was gone. The tag lay alone on the rail, as if it had been placed there by hand. Below the guardrail, the canyon opened wide and empty. 300 feet of vertical air dropped away to a floor of broken talus, scrub oak, and scattered deadfall. There was no ledge, no root tangle, no narrow shelf where a dog might have slipped and caught himself mid-fall. The canyon wall was nearly sheer for the first 100 feet, then angled back into loose shale and scattered juniper that clung to cracks in the rock. Nothing moved down there. No sound rose up. Hallis leaned over the rail and scanned the slope as far as the failing light would let him see, and saw nothing broken, nothing disturbed, no trace of fur or blood or struggle. He stepped back from the rail and looked at the road itself. Rex's paw prints were clear in the fine dust that had settled on the gravel since the last rain. 4 clean tracks, spaced in a steady running gait, coming forward from the third turn and continuing toward the fourth, and then 30 yards short of where the brass tag lay, the prints stopped. Not gradually, not in a skid or a scramble. They simply ended, mid-stride, as if the dog had been lifted straight up into the air and carried away. There were no drag marks, no scuff where claws might have scraped for purchase, no disturbance in the gravel at all past that final set of prints. Just clean road, undisturbed dust, and silence. Hallis called Rex's name, once, twice, then louder, his voice cracking the stillness. The echoes rolled down through the canyon and faded into the trees. He walked the length of the switchback twice, checking both sides of the road, checking the timber posts of the guardrail for scrape marks or fur, checking the gravel for any sign he might have missed in the dimming light. He found nothing. When he finally turned the coach around and drove it back down to the station yard, he carried the brass tag in his coat pocket, and later that night, when he tried to sleep, he said he could still feel the warmth of it against his ribs, even hours after it should have gone cold. The coach company sent 2 men and a tracking hound up the road that same night, carrying oil lanterns and a coil of rope in case they needed to descend into the canyon. The hound was a big liver-spotted animal bred for game tracking, steady and reliable, and he pulled hard on the lead all the way up to the third switchback. But when they reached the fourth turn, the place where Rex's prints ended and the brass tag had been found, the hound planted all 4 legs, dropped his belly to the gravel, and began to whine, a high, thin sound that didn't stop even when they tried to coax him forward with dried meat and soft words. They dragged him 10 feet closer to the guardrail. He twisted in the harness, claws scraping, and when they finally let him loose, he bolted back down the road and wouldn't come forward again. One of the men said later that the hound shook so hard they thought he'd pulled something in his chest, but when they brought him back to the station yard, he stood up fine, drank a full bowl of water, and slept through the rest of the night without making a sound. People around the high country in Colorado still tell that story to new drivers, and they tell them this too. You don't run the evening mail alone anymore, not on that road, not before full morning light, and you never, ever whistle on the fourth switchback, not even as a joke. The timeline made no sense from the start. Hallis had left the station yard at 4:47 that afternoon. The dispatcher marked it in the logbook with a stub of pencil, as he always did, noting the weather clear and the load light. And Rex had trotted beside the right front wheel of the coach, tail high, ears forward, moving easy and calm in the cool October air. 3 passengers rode the plank benches bolted to the coach sides that evening. A timber buyer heading up to the high logging camps, a woman in a gray wool coat visiting family in one of the canyon settlements, and a ranch hand coming back from town with a canvas bag of supplies and new boots tied to his belt. All 3 said later, when the dispatcher asked them to go over the evening step by step, that the dog had run steady alongside the wheels for the first 2 miles, never lagging, never pulling too far ahead, just keeping that easy loping pace he'd learned as a young dog. At the second switchback, where the road hooked sharp left and the view opened across the canyon, Rex broke into a faster lope and moved ahead of the lead horse, which was normal. Talus let him go. The dog knew the road better than most men who'd driven it for years. At the third switchback, Talus gave his usual whistle, 2 short notes rising slightly, and Rex surged forward around the next blind curve, disappearing from sight the way he always did. That was normal too. What wasn't normal was the silence that followed. Talus waited. He kept the horses moving at their steady uphill walk, listening for the sound of Rex's claws on gravel, listening for the bark that usually came when the dog reached the next turn and sat down to wait. He heard nothing. The canyon below the road was absolutely still. No wind, no bird call, no rustle of pine branches. The woman in the gray coat said later that the silence felt wrong, felt heavy, like the air had thickened. The ranch hand said the horses had started tossing their heads and pulling against the bits, which they hadn't done on any other part of the climb. When Talus rounded the blind curve into the fourth switchback, he found the road empty. The guardrail stood intact. No dog, no movement. And lying flat on the top rail 30 yards ahead was Rex's brass identification tag. Talus stopped the coach, set the brake, and climbed down. The passengers stayed in their seats and didn't speak. The timber buyer said later that he'd wanted to help look, but something about the way Talus moved, slow, careful, like a man approaching a tripwire, made him stay where he was. When Talus picked up the brass tag, it was warm. Not sun-warmed, because the sun had already dropped behind the western ridge and the air was cold enough to frost breath and sting the throat. It was warm the way metal gets when it's been held in a hand or carried close to a body. And when Talus closed his fingers around it, he said later he could feel a faint pulse of heat, like the tag had just been set down seconds before. The tag had been fastened to Rex's leather collar with a copper rivet punched through 2 layers of strap, the kind of fastening that doesn't come apart unless you cut the leather or pry the rivet out with a tool. The leather was gone. The rivet was gone. The tag lay alone on the iron rail, placed flat and centered as if someone had set it there deliberately. Talus walked to the edge of the guardrail and looked down into the canyon. 300 feet of empty air dropped away to a floor of broken talus and scrub oak. The canyon wall below the road was nearly vertical for the first 100 feet, then angled back into loose shale and juniper clinging to cracks and stone. There was no ledge, no shelf, no narrow outcrop where a dog might have slipped and caught himself. Nothing moved down there. No sound rose up. Talus called Rex's name, once, twice, then louder, and the echoes rolled down through the trees and faded. No bark answered. Nothing. He stepped back and examined the road. Rex's paw prints were clear in the fine dust that had settled since the last rain 3 days earlier. 4 clean tracks, evenly spaced, moving at a steady run from the third switchback toward the fourth, and then 30 yards short of the guardrail the print stopped. Not in a skid, not in a scatter of disturbed gravel. They simply ended mid-stride, all 4 paws lifting off the ground in a normal running gait, and then nothing. No drag marks, no scuff where claws might have scraped for purchase. No second set of tracks anywhere near that final print. Just clean gravel, and then 30 yards of empty road leading to the warm brass tag on the cold iron rail. Talus walked the length of the switchback twice, checking both sides, running his hands along the posts to feel for scratches or tufts of fur, kneeling in the gravel to look for blood or leather scraps. He found nothing. The timber buyer and the ranch hand climbed down and helped him search, walking shoulder to shoulder across the width of the road, eyes on the ground. The woman in the gray coat stayed in her seat, hands folded tight in her lap. After 20 minutes, Talus gave up, pocketed the brass tag, climbed back onto the bench and turned the coach around. He didn't speak on the way back down, and neither did any of the passengers. By 7 that evening, a group of 10 men had gathered at the station yard with oil lanterns, coiled rope, a tracking hound and wooden stakes and white cloth strips for marking search zones. They loaded into 2 coaches and drove back up in the failing light, reaching the 4th turn just after full dark. The hound was a big liver-spotted animal, steady and experienced, bred for tracking game through rough country. He pulled hard on the lead all the way to the third switchback, nose low, working the trail with confidence. But when they reached the fourth turn, the hound stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. He planted all four legs, dropped his belly flat to the gravel and began to whine, a high, thin sound that didn't stop even when his handler knelt beside him with strips of dried venison and soft words. They dragged the hound 10 feet closer. He twisted hard in the harness, claws scraping, and when they unclipped the lead to see what he'd do on his own, he bolted back down the road and refused to come forward again. One of the men said later the hound had shaken so violently they thought he'd injured something, but when they brought him back to the station yard, he stood up fine, drank water, and slept through the night without a sound. After that, nobody brought another dog up to the fourth switchback. The search party split into groups. 4 men walked the road in both directions, checking every foot of gravel with lanterns held low. 3 men descended partway into the canyon on ropes, swinging lantern light across the rock face and calling Rex's name into empty air. The echoes came back flat and dead. The remaining men worked the slope above the road, climbing through juniper and shale to check for places where a dog might have bolted uphill. They found deer trails, old scat, scattered elk bones, but no trace of Rex. Around 9 o'clock, one of the men noticed something strange. Earlier that evening, they'd tied strips of torn white cloth to several guardrail posts to mark sections already searched. One strip had been knotted tight to the post nearest where Hallis had found the brass tag. A double knot pulled hard, the kind that won't come loose in wind. The post stood firm and undamaged, but the white cloth strip was gone. They searched the gravel around the post with lanterns. Nothing. They checked below the guardrail, leaning out to scan the rock face for any sign the cloth had blown down. Nothing. One of the men, a ranch foreman who'd tied the original strip himself, swore he'd checked that knot twice and the cloth had been there less than an hour before. He tied a fresh strip to the same post, this time with 3 tight knots, and another man marked the time in a pocket notebook, 9:14 p.m. They kept searching until past 11, when the cold got bad enough that breath hung in clouds and fingers went numb inside gloves. They'd walked every inch of the fourth switchback twice, checked the canyon wall as far down as a man on a rope could safely go, and found no sign of Rex, no sign of struggle, and no explanation for the missing cloth. The man who'd tied the second strip checked it before they left. It was still there, 3 knots intact, pale fabric hanging limp in still air. They drove back down in silence. The next morning, just after first light, the same group went back up. When they reached the fourth switchback, the second cloth strip was gone. The post stood untouched. The knots hadn't been cut or untied, and the cloth had simply vanished. And lying on the gravel 15 feet downslope from the post in a spot they'd walked over and searched with lanterns a dozen times, was a small brass buckle, tarnished green at the edges, the kind used to fasten a dog's collar. It was clean. It was cold. And when they compared it to the brass tag Hallis still carried, the buckle didn't match. It was older, heavier, stamped with a maker's mark none of them recognized. The older hands in Colorado told the younger ones that same week, something on that stretch of road doesn't like to be watched, doesn't like to be marked, and doesn't give back what it takes. After that, nobody tied cloth strips to the rails on the fourth switchback. Nobody left tools or gear unattended near the spot where Rex's prints had ended, and the few drivers who still ran the evening mail started carrying a second man on the bench, even if it meant splitting the pay. Hallis himself went back up 3 more times over the next 10 days, always in daylight, always with at least 2 other men. They widened the search to include slopes above the road, thinking maybe Rex had been spooked and bolted uphill into timber. They found deer trails, old scat, winter-killed bones, but no trace of the dog. On the 5th day, a woman who lived in a cabin half a mile below the fourth switchback told them she'd heard a dog barking around dawn 2 mornings after Rex disappeared. 3 short barks, sharp and clear, coming from somewhere up near the road. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, but the timing stuck with her. She said it was just after 5, still dark, and the barking stopped as suddenly as it started. Hallis asked if she was certain about the time. She showed him the kitchen clock, 5 past 5. The same hour Rex used to start his evening run. That detail sat wrong with everyone. If the dog had barked at dawn 2 days after he vanished, that meant he'd been alive, somewhere close, and either couldn't get back or wouldn't come when called. Hallis walked up to the fourth switchback again that afternoon and stood at the guardrail for 20 minutes, calling Rex's name in every direction. The sound carried clear across the canyon. No bark came back, no movement in the timber, just wind in the high pines and the faint scrape of a hawk's cry far above. By the second week, people in the valley started talking. Some said Hallis had enemies, men he'd turned away from freight contracts, men who'd lost bids when the company picked him instead. Others said the dog had likely been taken by a cat or had fallen into a crack in the rocks nobody could see from the road. A few of the older women, the ones who'd lived in the high country since before the railroad came through, said the canyon past the fourth switchback had always been strange, the kind of ground that didn't give back what it took, and they said it quiet, like they didn't want to be heard. Nobody used the word haunted, but nobody laughed at the idea either. Hallis stopped running the evening mail after the third week. The company reassigned him to lower valley routes, flat easy runs that didn't climb past the timber line, and they put 2 new men on the switchback route with orders to travel in pairs and carry a rifle between them. The first time those 2 men ran the fourth turn together, just after sunset they heard a low whistle, 2 notes rising, coming from somewhere below the road, down in the canyon where no trail led and no man could stand without ropes. Neither of them whistled back. They whipped the horses hard and didn't slow down until they reached the valley station, and when the dispatcher asked why they'd come in so fast, they didn't answer right away. Finally, one of them said, "We heard it." That was all. The dispatcher didn't ask what it was. He just marked the time in the logbook and told them they'd done right by not stopping. The search became a ritual. Every morning for 2 weeks, men gathered at the station yard before sunrise, drank coffee from tin cups in silence, and rode up the switchbacks with the same tools they'd carried the day before: lanterns, rope, wooden stakes, canvas sacks for anything they might find. They worked in a grid pattern, marking off sections of the canyon slope with stakes driven into soft ground, dragging grappling hooks through shallow creeks that fed down from the high country, checking every crevice in the rock face wide enough to trap a body. Women from the valley brought food at midday, bread wrapped in cloth, jars of stew still warm, coffee in heavy thermoses, and stood on the road watching the men work, shawls pulled tight around their shoulders, even when the sun was high. Nobody spoke much. The work had a weight to it, a rhythm that felt older than the search itself, like they were performing a duty the land required whether or not it would give anything back. On the 9th day, a lumber foreman named Krill found something that changed the way everyone looked at the case. He'd been working the slope above the fourth switchback, climbing through dense juniper and loose talus, checking places where a dog might have scrambled uphill and gotten wedged between rocks. Around noon, he stopped to rest on a flat shelf of granite about 60 feet above the road and noticed a scrap of paper wedged into a crack in the stone, held in place by a small round pebble. The paper was folded once, creased sharp, and when Krill pulled it free and unfolded it, he found a single line written in pencil, block letters, careful and deliberate. "Check the fence line past the gate." He brought it down to the road and showed it to the others. Nobody spoke for a long time. The handwriting was neat, square, the kind a man uses when he's writing something he wants read clearly, and several of the men recognized it immediately. It was Hallis's hand. They'd all seen him write in the station logbooks, marking loads and times and weather notes in that same tight script. But Hallis hadn't been up on the slope that morning. He'd been down in the valley working a lower route, and when they sent a rider to bring him up to look at the note, he went pale and said he hadn't written it, hadn't been on that slope in over a week, and couldn't explain how his handwriting had gotten onto a piece of paper wedged into rock 60 feet above the road where Rex had disappeared. One of the older men, a cattle driver named Ibarra who'd worked the high country for 30 years, held the paper up to the light and examined it closely. The pencil marks were fresh, not faded, and the paper itself was clean. No water stains, no dirt ground into the fibers, no sign it had been exposed to weather. He folded it carefully and handed it back to Hallis without saying a word. But his face had gone hard and closed, the way men's faces go when they've seen something they don't want to name out loud. Later that afternoon, Ibarra told the younger men in the search party that in all his years in Colorado, he'd learned one rule that never failed. When the land starts talking back, you listen, but you don't ask it to repeat itself. They checked the fence line past the gate. It was an old boundary fence that ran along the upper edge of a cattle pasture half a mile east of the fourth switchback, wire strung between split rail posts, some of them rotted at the base and leaning hard. They walked the length of the fence for 200 yards, checking the ground on both sides, looking for prints, disturbed earth, anything out of place. They found nothing, but when they reached the far end of the fence line, where the wire terminated at a stand of ponderosa pine growing tight against a rock outcrop, they smelled smoke. Not wood smoke from a campfire or a distant hearth. This was sharper, metallic, like hot iron left too long in a forge. The smell was strong enough that it made their eyes water, but there was no fire, no source, no sign of char or ash on the ground. The smell hung in the air for less than a minute, and then it was gone, replaced by the clean pine scent of the high country and the faint dusty smell of dry grass. Two of the men turned back immediately. They didn't run, but they walked fast, and when they reached the road, they told the others they weren't going back to that fence line, not for pay, not for anything. One of them, a young ranch hand named Soto, said later that the smell hadn't been the worst part. The worst part had been the way the air felt around the fence line, heavy and wrong, like standing too close to a cliff edge in the dark when you can't see the drop, but you can feel it pulling at you. People in Colorado still tell that story when they talk about the search for wrecks, and they tell it quiet, the way you tell a thing you don't fully understand but can't forget. Theories spread through the valley like water finding cracks in stone. Some said Hallis had enemies, men who'd lost freight contracts when the mail company chose him over them, men who might have taken the dog as a warning or a message. A few riders went out to the camps and settlements scattered through the high country, asking questions, checking on men who'd been heard making threats or holding grudges. But nobody turned up anything solid. Others said a cat had taken the dog, a lion or a big tom lynx that had come down from the ridges looking for easier game than deer. But cats don't leave brass tags warm on guardrails, and they don't take dogs without leaving blood or drag marks, and the men who'd hunted cats in that country for 20 years said the theory didn't hold. A handful of people, mostly older women who'd lived in the canyon settlement since before the mail route was established, said the fourth switchback had always been a strange place, a bend in the road where things didn't behave the way they should. They said cattle wouldn't cross that section after dark without balking. They said birds didn't roost in the pines above the guardrail, even in winter when every other tree in the canyon was full of them. They said the ground there didn't give back what it took, and they'd known that long before Rex disappeared, long before the mail coaches started running that road 6 days a week. Nobody called it haunted. Nobody used words like spirit or ghost, but the way they talked about it, careful, indirect, like people stepping around a hole in the floor they can't see but know is there, made it clear they believed something lived on that stretch of road, something that didn't want to be seen and didn't like being marked or measured or named. By the third week, the organized search parties stopped. There was nowhere left to walk that didn't already hold their boot prints. The canyon slopes had been combed from the road down to the creek beds. The fence lines had been checked. The timber above the switchbacks had been walked through in every direction. They'd found nothing. No body, no fur, no sign of struggle. Just the brass tag, the unmatched buckle, and the note in Hallis's handwriting that he swore he hadn't written. The men who'd been searching every day went back to their regular work, cattle drives, timber contracts, freight runs, and the women went back to their kitchens and gardens. But nobody forgot, and nobody stopped talking about it. Hallis kept the brass tag in his coat pocket for months afterward. He said he couldn't bring himself to throw it away or bury it or leave it somewhere out of sight. Sometimes, late at night, he'd take it out and hold it in his palm. And he swore that on certain nights, usually when the air was still and cold, the way it had been the evening Rex disappeared, the tag would feel warm again, just for a few seconds, like it was remembering something. He told that to Ibarra once over a bottle of whiskey in the back room of a valley saloon, and Ibarra didn't laugh or tell him he was imagining things. He just nodded and said, "Some things don't let go, even when you want them to." The mail company kept 2 men on the switchback route after that, And they kept a rifle on the bench even though nobody could say what they were supposed to shoot if trouble came. Drivers who ran that road learned fast not to whistle on the fourth turn, not to stop and look too long at the spot where the brass tag had been found, and not to answer if they heard anything that sounded like a dog barking from down in the canyon. The older drivers told the new ones, "You keep your eyes on the road, you keep the horses moving, and you don't ask questions about things you hear that shouldn't be there." Children growing up in the valley settlements heard the story from their parents and grandparents, and they learned the same rules. Don't go up to the fourth switchback alone. Don't call out into the canyon for fun, and if you hear a two-note whistle rising from below the road, you turn around and walk the other way without looking back. It became part of the common knowledge of the place, the kind of thing everyone knew without needing to be told twice. And in all the years that followed, nobody ever found Rex, and nobody ever explained the warm brass tag, the missing cloth strips, the note in Hallis's handwriting, or the smell of hot iron where no fire had burned. People in Colorado still drive that road, though it's paved now and the guardrails are steel instead of iron and timber. But the fourth switchback is still there, and the canyon below it is still 300 feet of empty air and broken rock. And the older people in the valley towns still tell the younger ones the same thing Ibarra told the search party back in 1927. When the land starts talking back, you listen, but you don't ask it to repeat itself. And you sure as hell don't whistle. Years passed. The mail route kept running, though the company eventually moved it to daylight hours only and required 2 men on the bench at all times, even when the load was light and the weather clear. Hallis left Colorado in 1931, took work on a freight line in Wyoming, and never came back to the switchbacks. He died in 1949. And when they went through his effects, they found the brass tag still in his coat pocket, wrapped in a square of cloth and tied with string, like something you'd keep if you couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't let it go either. His daughter sent it back to the mail company office in Colorado, with a note saying her father had asked, near the end, that it be buried somewhere on the fourth switchback, but the company never did it. Nobody wanted to go up there alone to dig, and nobody wanted to be the one responsible for putting that object back into the ground where Rex had disappeared. The tag sat in a drawer in the station office for 15 years, and then one morning it was gone. Nobody admitted to taking it. Nobody asked where it went. The road itself changed. In 1935, the state paved the lower sections and widened the switchbacks enough that 2 vehicles could pass without one of them having to back up to a turnout. They reinforced the guardrails with steel cable and concrete posts, built stone retaining walls where the shale was worst, and improved the drainage so spring runoff wouldn't wash out the road every April. But they didn't change the fourth switchback. Contractors who bid on that section backed out after walking the site. Equipment broke down in ways that made no sense. Engines flooding on dry days, hydraulic lines bursting for no reason, tires going flat on all 4 corners of a truck at the same time. One crew foreman said later that his men refused to work that turn after the 3rd day, said the air felt wrong and the ground didn't sit right under their boots. And he didn't argue with them because he'd felt it too. The state eventually left the fourth switchback alone, patched the surface every few years and let it be. The rules around that stretch of road became culture. Parents in the valley towns told their children the story of Rex the way other families told fairy tales or Bible stories, except this one was true and it had happened close enough that people still alive remembered it. Don't go up to the fourth switchback alone. Don't stop your car there after dark. If you hear a whistle or a bark coming from below the road, keep driving and don't look back. Don't leave anything on the guardrail. No flowers, no markers, no cloth tied to the posts. The land doesn't like to be marked. The land doesn't give back. In 1953, a high school boy from one of the canyon settlements took his girlfriend up to the fourth switchback at night on a dare. He parked his father's truck on the shoulder, left the engine running and the headlights on, and walked with her to the guardrail to look down into the canyon. They stood there for maybe 2 minutes, not saying much, just looking at the drop and the dark trees below. Then the girl said she heard something, a low 2-note whistle, rising slightly at the end, coming from somewhere down in the canyon where no trail led and no person could stand without climbing gear and rope. The boy laughed and said it was probably wind in the pines or an owl or something, but she grabbed his arm hard and said, "We need to leave, right now." They got back in the truck and he started to turn it around, but when he put it in reverse, the engine died. He tried to start it again, Nothing. The battery was fine. The tank was half full. The truck had been running perfectly 30 seconds before. He tried again. Dead. They got out and started walking down the road on foot, and the girl said later that she'd heard footsteps behind them. Not boots on gravel, but something softer and faster, like paws on packed dirt. And when she turned to look, there was nothing there, just the empty road and the truck sitting dark and silent under the stars. They walked 2 miles down to the nearest house and called the boy's father, who drove up with a friend and a tow chain. When they reached the 4th switchback, the truck started on the first try. No hesitation, no sputter. The boy's father didn't say much, just hooked the chain and towed it back down to the valley. And when they got home, he told his son that if he ever went up to that turn again after dark, he'd lose the truck and a hell of a lot more besides. The boy never went back. Neither did the girl. And when people in Colorado tell that story now, they tell it as a warning, not as entertainment. In the 1970s, a young doctor moved to one of the valley towns to work at the rural clinic, and he didn't believe in any of the stories about the 4th switchback. He thought they were folklore, small-town superstition, the kind of thing people invented to make boring places seem more interesting. One evening in late autumn, he drove up alone to see the spot for himself, parked his car on the shoulder, and walked to the guardrail with a flashlight and a camera. He took pictures. He walked the length of the switchback twice, examining the road surface and the rock face and the canyon below. He found nothing unusual, no strange marks, no signs of anything that would justify the stories. He got back in his car feeling satisfied that he'd proven the whole thing was nonsense, and he drove back down to the valley. 3 days later, he developed the film. Most of the pictures came out fine, clear images of the road, the guardrail, the canyon in twilight, but one photograph, taken from the exact spot where Hallis had found the brass tag in 1927, showed something the doctor didn't remember seeing when he'd been standing there. In the lower right corner of the frame, just visible in the shadow below the guardrail, was a shape that looked like a dog sitting upright, ears forward facing the camera. The shape was blurred, indistinct, like it had moved just as the shutter clicked. But the outline was clear enough that several people who saw the photograph later said it looked exactly like a German shepherd. The doctor kept the photograph for a few months, showed it to a few colleagues, and then one morning he burned it in his wood stove and never talked about it again. When someone asked him why, he said only, "I don't need to prove anything anymore." The brass tag reappeared twice over the years. Once in 1968, when a highway crew working on a culvert repair below the 4th switchback found it lying on top of a drainage grate, clean and dry, even though the grate was half submerged in runoff water. They turned it into the county office, and it sat in a storage box for 6 months before it vanished again. The second time was in 1981, when a woman hiking alone on a trail that ran parallel to the switchback road found it lying in the center of the trail, placed flat on a bed of pine needles, as if someone had set it there carefully, and walked away. She picked it up, read the stamped name and address, and brought it to the mail company office, which by then had been absorbed into a regional postal service. They didn't know what to do with it, so they filed it in an archive box with other historical items, and as far as anyone knows, it's still there, though nobody has checked in a long time and nobody particularly wants to. People in Colorado still drive the switchbacks, and the 4th turn is still part of the route, though most locals take the newer highway that bypasses the high country altogether and cuts through a tunnel blasted into the ridge. The old road is used mostly by tourists and by a few older drivers who grew up on it and know it too well to take another way. But even those drivers, the ones who've been running that road for 30 or 40 years, will tell you the same thing. You don't stop on the 4th switchback unless you have to. You don't whistle or call out for fun. And if you hear something that sounds like a dog barking or a 2-note whistle rising from the canyon below, you keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road, and you don't acknowledge it. Some things, they say, don't want to be found, and some things don't want to be remembered, and the 4th switchback is the place where both of those truths live side by side, and nobody asks which one is worse. There are 3 versions of what happened to Rex that October evening in 1927. The human version says someone took the dog, a rival, an enemy, a drifter passing through, and disposed of the body in a way that left no trace, and the warm brass tag and the missing cloth strips and the note in Hallis's handwriting were either coincidence or deliberate misdirection. The natural version says the dog fell or was taken by a predator in a way that left no obvious evidence, and the rest, the warmth, the sounds, the smell of hot iron, were products of fear and grief, and the way memory distorts when something terrible happens in a place that already feels wrong. And then there's the third version, the one nobody in Colorado says out loud but everyone knows. The version that says the fourth switchback is a thin place where the ordinary world doesn't hold the way it should, and Rex didn't fall and wasn't taken by man or animal, but instead stepped across some invisible line that runs through that section of road. And everything that followed, the warm tag, the vanishing cloth, the note, the whistle heard by drivers years later, is just the land trying to hand back what it took over and over because it doesn't know how to let go any more than the people who lost him do. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Colorado dares to say out loud? And what detail in this story should not exist in a world that follows normal rules? The brass tag still warm in freezing air, the note in handwriting that wasn't written, or the whistle that keeps coming back decades after the dog is gone? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.